micro and nano-electrochemical techniques in corrosion research. Corrosion of metals is electrochemical in nature, and you can see from this graph, when corrosion happens, it's involved at least the interfacial charge transfer reaction and the mass transfer of corrosion species in the solution. So we usually use electrochemical principle to describe the thermodynamics and the kinetics of corrosion reaction. So as a result, corrosion research can be measured and studied by different electrochemical techniques. So for example, we use a Stern-Green equation in electrochemistry to do the linear polarization resistance measurement to quickly determine corrosion rate. We can also use the Baltimore-Wormley equation to study the fundamentals and the mechanism of corrosion reactions. So that's a lot of different electrochemical techniques used in corrosion research. At the same time, we also realize the conventional electrochemical techniques suffer from a couple limitations. The major problem is these techniques has a limited capability to measure the corrosion happening at the small scales. For example, the small scale we always mention is micron or even sub-micron dimensions. But at the same time, the industry infrastructure can suffer from corrosion-induced failure. And this corrosion usually starts from the micro or even sub-micron scales. So that's why there is a gap between the electrochemical measurements and the real corrosion-induced failures. So based on this background, the driving force for corrosion research is development of and innovation of different advanced techniques. So the important trend is the integration of electrochemical techniques and the surface analysis techniques. So the principle actually is very straightforward. We can do the corrosion measurements. At the same time, we use the surface analysis technique to control the measurement focused on the certain dimension. A typical example is the micron scale and the nanoscale. So in this talk, because of a limited time, I only introduce a couple micro and nano electrochemical techniques we conducted in corrosion science research in the past decade. And why we need to do the micron or nanoscale corrosion research. And I use these slides to quickly give you some couple reasons. So when we use metal materials in industry and used for the different microstructure, and when we look at the microstructure of these metals, we can always see a different size of the metallurgical features. And these features can be micron scaled or nanoscaled. These features can influence the mechanical properties at the same time to influence the performance of the materials in practice. At the same time, the industrial structure can also have different surface features. So these surface features is caused by mechanical forces. And these features and the finish can also the microns or sub-micron scale. And the number 3 reason is in order to improve the mechanical property of the metals, and we can have the many advanced processing technique, and such as we produce the precipitates and the secondary phases in order to improve the mechanical property, such as the strength and the ductility. But these are also micron or sub-micron scale can influence the corrosion features. Finally, when we perform the surface engineering and to produce some of the surface film, and this film usually can be arranged from the micron or even nanoscaled in terms of the thickness. So when this film is damaged due to different reasons, we can have the pitting corrosion, for example, and this pitting corrosion usually start from the micron scale. So that's why from this slide, you can see when we research corrosion science, we always meet the very small dimensions problem. And that's a driving force. We introduce or have the innovation of the micron or nano-electrochemical measurement techniques. Okay, next, and I think if we perform the materials science research or surface science research, and we are supposed to know a very important technique is AFM, atomic force microscopy. So AFM, in principle, is one of the most sensitive techniques to study the materials property, especially in the surface or subsurface properties. So, and because of the limited time, I do not go to much detail of the AFM. But basically, it can give you atomic or even you can say the nanoscaled, the surface morphology or topographic information of the materials and the research. But if we combine electrochemical and AFM together, we can develop ECAFM. So basically, the ECAFM is made of the combination of electrochemical potential studied with AFM. And because it's a very small scaled, so the setup of the electrochemical measurements actually is very challenging. Because in a very small area, we need to set up the typical electrode in order to enforce the electrochemical measurements. But we need the very careful person to set up the experimental testing facility. At the same time, we need a very, very good and control system to enable we can get the nanoscaled features at the same time with the electrochemical polarization control. So next, I will show you very typical research results, and we use ECAFM to get the electrochemical corrosion features as a very, very small scale, as usually is the nanoscale. And you can see very interesting results. Firstly, and very simple, when we perform the surface treatment, we usually have a very different dimensions of the surface feature. And this surface feature, we can characterize with the AFM. So you can see, and based on the 4 different types of the treatment, we get the nanoscaled surface roughness. And this is the surface characterization. So if this kind of the materials is performed in a certain environment, and we can realize corrosion will happen on the surface. And if we go to the conventional electrochemical measurement techniques, so you can see from the 2 results on the right side, you cannot see much difference between the 4 surface roughness. So, and if you get the results from here, and you can see, oh, the surface roughness does not influence the corrosion of the metal because the measurement curve almost reproduce each other, almost copy each other. But if we look at the detail, we use the ECAFM. That's a very different pictures. So I use the 2 typical surface roughness as an example. And this just showing you, and we produce the surface of the metal with the 400 grade, the silicon papers. And we have the roughness like this. And B and C is AFM topographic pictures. And when we put the metal in the corrosive environment, the surface solution, and as a function of time, we do observe a certain feature such as 1, 2, 3 in this graph suffer from the different dissolution rate. So that means even the surface feature is nanoscaled, they have the different corrosion rate. So as a comparison, if we produce a surface with the finer and scaled, such as 1 micron diamond paste, and you can see the surface is very finer and more beautiful compared with 400 silicon papers. But even in these features, and if we look at a much detailed scale, and the dissolution rate are different. So this can give you a very detailed features. Even the surface feature is nanoscale, they suffer from different corrosion rate. And if we compare the different stages of the corrosion development on the surface of the metal, and basically in the beginning, the dissolution rate is faster, and after a certain time, the dissolution will go to a relatively steady stage. And based on the characterization of the surface topography, and we can determine the corrosion rate as a 2 stages. And basically, you can see when the surface roughness going down, and with improved surface treatment, the corrosion rate usually going down. So that's give you a basic idea. If we can create a very, very refined the surface features, and the extreme example is a glass and a leveled surface feature, and we can control the corrosion rate go to a very, very low level. So that's a corrosion rate going down if the surface feature and improved based on the surface treatment. And so that's a surface feature based on the mechanical treatment. Another typical important research area is a surface film. So when we perform the material science research, and the surface film is usually conducted in a very extensive level. And for the surface film, a very typical example is a passive film. Passive film actually, in most cases, is a surface oxide. So you can see we can use the ECAFM to characterize the surface feature of the passive film is nanoscaled. When we put the passive film as a different formation potential, we do find the nanoscaled features of the film has a very different features. So these features is in the nanoscale, but they have the different dissolution rate. So this gives us and the basic idea. When the passive film is formed as a different foundation, and even their surface feature is not scaled, they still can give you a different corrosion rate. So this corrosion rate actually is important because you can see from the comparison of the two ECAFM, the surface image, and when the film is formed as a different solution and sodium bicarbonate solution, but with a different concentration, the surface topography picture is very, very different. So the different corrosion rate can cause what? Can cause the initiation of the pitting corrosion. So that's why the nanoscaled passive film can also suffer from the different and corrosion rate. And this can give you another one. We have the cross-section topographic pictures. So that's showing you a very different surface topographies and when the film is formed in the different corrosion solution. So in addition to the passive film, and inhibitor is a very typical technique to control corrosion. So when we characterize the inhibitor film, you can see, and when the metal is covered by the organic inhibitor film, and in terms of the nanoscale, in the different solution with a different pH, and the surface topography is quite different. That just tells us, and this different surface topography is caused by the different property of corrosion inhibitors. So that's another important application of the nano scaled ECAFM to characterize the surface film feature in corrosion environment. So for the metal, when we analyze to form the nanoscaled surface film, and this application is mainly used to produce the different surface roughness of the film for the anti-biological attachment of the bacteria. So because the nanoscaled film can enable the surface with no surface energy, and then to reduce the attachment of the bacteria to the surface. So you can see from the left, and based on the ECAFM characterization, and we can create the analyzing film with a different surface roughness, and this surface roughness has a different photoelectrochemical activity, consequently can reduce the attachment of the bacteria and to the surface film, and then to improve and anti-biofouling properties of the metals. So that's a very important application in terms of the bacteria active environment. So, and right now, because of limited time, I summarize a typical important application of the nanoscaled ECAFM. So that's electrochemical AFM in the corrosion research. But from the large scale application, typically from the industry application, the micron scale, it seems more realistic, because when corrosion does happen, and it will usually start from the micron scale. So that's why in the following slides, I will discuss the micron scale electrochemical techniques in corrosion research. The first one is the metallurgical micron electrochemistry. I just mentioned in the metal, we usually have different types of micron-scaled metallurgical features, such as non-mechanical inclusions and some of the precipitates and the secondary phases. So these are typical micron-scaled metallurgical defects. At the same time, the metal structure in the surface environment and the usually can form the micron-scaled pitting corrosion. So it's not the general corrosion, but it's a localized corrosion. So this pitting corrosion in the study stage usually is a micron-scaled. So the quick question, when we have these micron-scaled features, a quick question is how these metallurgical features will influence localized corrosion. So what is the mechanism? In order to answer these questions, I just mentioned, we need to introduce the micron electrochemical techniques for the characterization. For example, in these slides, and micron-scaled aluminum oxide inclusion is included in the steel. When we use a localized electrochemical impedance measurements, we can characterize when the microprobe passes the inclusion, we can measure the fluctuation of the impedance signal. So that tells us at this inclusion, the electrochemical impedance will give you different signals that characterize different electrochemical activities. So based on the comparison before and after corrosion happens, and we can characterize when the localized pitting corrosion is formed and the inclusion still exists in the corrosion pits. So that means this inclusion has a high stability and low electrochemical activity compared with the steel matrix. So we can characterize the inclusion is cathodic relative to the steel matrix. So that gives you the mechanism. If we have the aluminum oxide inclusion in the steel, how pitting corrosion will happen is actually based on the preferential corrosion of the steel substrate. So if we have another type of the inclusion, in this example, this inclusion is a silicon enriched. But after the micron-scaled pitting corrosion is formed, the silicon inclusion is gone, is dissolved. So based on this principle, we can say silicon enriched inclusion actually has a high electrochemical activity. So we can characterize this kind of inclusion is anodic in principle. So this gives you a very direct results and direct evidence. Different types of the metallurgical features in the metal can give the preferential localized corrosion, but based on the different mechanism. So another one, if we look at the microstructure of metals, we can always observe the grains and green boundary. So these green and green boundaries have the different electrochemical activity. But we can also use the micron electrochemical techniques to characterize the different electrochemical and corrosion activity. We found that the green and the green boundary have the different corrosion activity. Finally, we can find the pitting corrosion. Actually, in this case, is formed in the green area. So that means the green boundary is under the certain engineering process to improve the stability. Consequently, the corrosion will preferentially happen at the greens. So these are very advanced steels used in the engineering structure, and because the green boundary is under the spatial treatment to improve the stability. So, and welding is a very typical engineering processing technique to join the parts together. But you can see from this, I will speed up a little bit because I found the time is quickly approach my time limit. But you can see from this graph, so if the parts is welded together, and you can see the welding area and will suffer from the different corrosion activity, we can observe the enhanced dissolution in the welding area. So that means the welding can also suffer from the preferential corrosion. So this area actually is a micron scaled. And the small crack is a very typical failure mechanism and to cause the accident for the large engineering structure. But in the initial stage, this crack usually is micron scaled. So we can use Nano-Electrochemical techniques to measure the corrosion rate as a crack, especially as a crack tip. So we can find as a crack tip, there is an enhanced corrosion current and a reduced impedance as a crack tip. So that means the crack tip will suffer from increased corrosion. So these features can only achieved by the micro-electrochemical techniques. So hydrogen usually is a clean energy, but hydrogen can also introduce some of the embrittlement problem to the metals. At the same time, when hydrogen is introduced into the metal, it can also increase the corrosion as a crack tip. So we can use the micro-electrochemical technique to measure when the metal is introduced the hydrogen with a different concentration, and then the crack tip can suffer from the different corrosion rate. So we can exactly measure the hydrogen-induced corrosion rate as a typical site, such as a crack tip with a micron scale. So for the micron scaled corrosion, another typical application is coating. So coating can suffer from the disbonding, can have the different breakage, and also have the different pinholes. So this failure usually is micron scaled. So because of time, I also only present the corrosion at the coating pinholes. That's a micron scaled. You can see how the coating small pinhole and can influence the localized corrosion. At the same time, and I will firstly present the conventional electrochemical technique, that's the impedance technique, to measure the coating with a pinhole. But basically, you cannot characterize how the small pinhole will influence the localized corrosion. So, and if you research the literature, I believe you usually can find if the coating has a pinhole, you use a conventional impedance technique, you can measure this kind of the signal. You cannot get any micron scaled information. But if I introduce the localized impedance technique, I can measure the micron scaled impedance information. So the probe can get the information as small as 10 microns. So that's a small pinholes area. So you can compare the different time the impedance information as a small pinhole is located. In this case, is about 100 microns pinhole. And you can see the impedance has the different features. So different feature can give you the different corrosion information. So that's why, and we can have you can see we can have the different mechanisms as a pinhole, as a coating. Finally, and micro-electrochemical technique can also study corrosion and the deposit. A typical example is a corrosion product scale. And you can see typical corrosion products is in CO2 environment, and the iron carbonate scale has a different microstructure when they formed at a different temperature. And we can use localized impedance and to measure the different porosity can introduce a different corrosion rate. So that's typically the porosity is a micron scaled. And we can use this measurement information to characterize the microstructure of the corrosion scale. And finally, we can establish how this scale will influence the further corrosion. Okay, and to conclude my talk today, we can say corrosion science research, and we'll go to the more mechanical level if we can develop different types of the micron and nanoscaled electrochemical technique. So this technique is very, very critical to improve our fundamental understanding of the corrosion science. And finally, corrosion and electrochemistry can be combined together and to improve the fundamental research. And this is the end of my talk. And again, I thank the